peacemaker a long time before the original 5 nations made peace with each other.
Hiawatha and the peace messenger went to visit the Mohawk Nation, and they were the keeper of the eastern door, as we speak of them. And Hiawatha introduced the peace messenger, that he had come with a great message that would help all the Iroquois people. So the peace messenger took an arrow from his quiver, and he brought it forth, and he held it up this way, and he said, "This is one nation. It will represent the Mohawk Nation, and it's alone." So he said, "See how easily I can break that arrow?" And he broke it without any effort. "See," he said, "one alone is weak and defenseless, and it breaks easily. The enemy could come and take you over and annihilate you." And then he reached back and he brought out 5 arrows. Now he said, "This bundle of arrows represents the 5 nations of the Iroquois." And he said, "Now I will try to break this one." And he tried, but he couldn't even bend them. They were so strong. Now he said, "You see, there is strength in unity, and together all the Iroquois nations will not be overcome by the enemy. You stick together in peace and harmony, and you will be strong and can overcome all evil things." And the Mohawk chief was very glad to hear this message. So they sent a group of Mohawks along, and Hiawatha and the peace messenger went and visited the Oneidas, and they listened, and they sent a delegation, and they visited the Onondagas. But here lived the old chief who was so cruel and evil, and this is how he kept his reign over people. He had them so frightened and so scared that if anybody disagreed with him, something terrible would happen to them or one of their family. He would kill people to impress them that what he said was law. They were not to go against him. And he refused to listen. So they took their delegation and went on to the Cayugas, and they listened, and then they went on to the Senecas, and they listened. And then they had to start over again and try to convince the Onondagas. Now this took years. This didn't happen overnight. So they worked at it little by little, and they would go back each time to the Onondaga to see if they could soften up the old chief, who was pictured with snakes coming out of his head. This shows his cruelty, his meanness, the venom that he had. Now Hiawatha was going to have the high honor of wearing the deer horn headdress. This was a very high honor, and he would be called the peace chief. And this was about as great an honor as there could be. But he said, "If this chief here at Onondaga will accept this honor from me, I will gladly step down. And if only we can bring peace." Now this was the last resort. So the old chief with the snakes in his hair had so much ego and was so full of himself that he accepted that, because he wanted to be, the great one, the big one, the one responsible for the peace. So he accepted, and this is how peace came to be. Well, they planted a tree of peace, which was a white pine, and the white roots came out in all 4 directions, and this means it would reach people in all the directions that needed to be protected under this wonderful peace tree, which represented the Confederacy and their great laws. And under the roots, by the roots there, they threw all their weapons of war, that they would never ever fight again, but they would be kind and loving to each other and helpful to each other. And this is how the Confederacy began.
According to tradition, the tree of peace was planted near Onondaga Lake. There, the peacemaker recited the great law to the 50 chiefs of the council. The law laid out a complete system of government and guaranteed wide-ranging individual rights. Even today, the great law is recited in the Longhouse. It has been passed down orally generation after generation. In the latter part of the 17th century, the Iroquois nations became so powerful that their influence spread far beyond their original territories in upstate New York. Some Indians claim that the Confederacy also had a strong influence on the government of the United States.
How important was the influence of the Iroquois over this government?
I think it was very important because prior to that, when they were living in Europe, they used to live under the kings and queens, and nobody had any rights. They didn't have any democracy. But they found it here on this island, especially with the Iroquois people.
Now, before the Revolution, Washington and some of his statesmen, Jefferson and Hancock and many others, Franklin was one of the main admirers, for ever since about 1750, they had visited the Iroquois Confederacy when they were in council. And they admired them, and they thought, what a wonderful, strong government, because they were curious as to what made them strong. And they found out by visiting these meetings the superior type of government they had and the wonderful logic that these people had. So they decided after the Revolution, when they were going to start the United States, they thought, what a wonderful government. And Washington, he called us wolves, you know, savage wolves. He couldn't believe that pagan, wild people living in the forest could have such a wonderful government. And that they seemed to be, well, he said, almost as smart as white people.
By having a contact with the Iroquois leaders at that time, they started to have a revolutionary spirit. They wanted to be free, just like the Indians they saw. In fact, they dressed up as Indians and they made a Boston Tea Party because that's the spirit that they want to show, you know, the free spirit of the Indians, and they want to be like them. And so by 1775, 1776, they made the Declaration of Independence. And there were Iroquois leaders at Independence Hall.
So when they wrote their Constitution, they did call on the Iroquois for help. And they were ensconced in a room upstairs. But they were cautioned not to get near the windows so that the white people would know they were there. They didn't want anyone to know that they were hobnobbing with savages to write a Constitution. And they patterned it after ours and a lot of their laws, but they didn't go far enough. They had, well, it says in their equal rights, but really there were no equal rights only for white people. There were no equal rights for people of color. There were no equal rights for Indians. We were not even citizens, you know. And women had no rights at all. So there were quite a few differences in their Constitution and ours. But basically, it was fashioned after ours.
The Constitution really was viewed by our people because it said it would be the supreme law of the land, because it would protect all the treaties and agreements that were made between our people and the United States. That in the future they would not encroach into our territory, which they did anyway. And after a certain length of time, our people were invaded by smallpox and disease and alcoholism, and so they were reduced to poverty.
The once powerful Confederacy is now split up into numerous reservations and territories throughout New York and Canada. Through all the years of oppression, the traditions of the Longhouse people have survived. The eagle at the top of the great tree of peace will continue to protect his people.
He is a symbol of seeing great distances. Because the eagle flies the highest, he is able to see many things that we cannot see. And so the meaning behind the eagle is that each individual in the Iroquois Confederacy, when it was formed, were instructed that amongst the people would be born people who would have the ability to see into the future and recognize certain dangers approaching. And the meaning behind that, they would be like the eagle that sees far. And they would be responsible by sounding an alarm, just like the eagle would sound an alarm. And so in today's time, to give you an example, I have seen into the future myself. I see the destruction of the trees in the world. I see the destruction of the rivers from the pollution. And I see the destruction of the air that we breathe. Now, my reaction to that is that because I have been instructed to work towards peace, I have to come out from the symbols of the Tree of Peace and travel and share that knowledge with other people and groups so that maybe it would help them in their own areas to strengthen them so that they would recognize the importance of planting trees. And so I have been traveling worldwide planting these trees for peace. And it's working. We planted some trees in Australia 2 years ago. And last summer they passed a resolution to plant 1 billion trees in Australia. A month ago we planted a tree on Mount Fuji in Japan. And I planted probably in every state in the Union. And so these are the kind of symbols that are important that's tied to the trees. It's not only the political part that we must always be careful about. It is also our environment, you know. So everything is all tied together. That's why they say our great law is the great binding law, because our spiritual responsibility that comes from the beginning of time is reinforced by law, and they have been brought together.
We believe that every living thing has a spirit, and every living thing has a right to be here. Not just man, or not just any certain thing, but all together living in harmony and forming this circle that is in complete balance. Because when one thing is gone and destroyed, this takes away a link of this circle and weakens it.